My deep time is really the issue in this film. And I think as we began to talk about it, and I know this has been controversial to people, I knew it would be controversial when we set it up, that our issue is we're not talking about naturalism, we're not talking about this issue of the philosophy that came out of the Enlightenment, but we're talking about what I would say is the history that came out of the Enlightenment. And I think this has been missed by many people in the origins debate. They talk about it, but they don't often see it as essential. I even had a seminary professor we were discussing with, who's a young earth creationist, who complained. He said, I think you're setting up a false dichotomy here. I think you're saying that, there are more Christians that can hold to an old earth view. And I think let's define this here. If you look at the playing field, you will say then very much there are your classic, your young earth or, young age creationists who would fall in the lines of that the world is less than 10,000 years old. And this is what you see from Josephus, and you see it in Augustine, though Augustine may have had an unusual view with the 6 days. All of the church fathers, the thousands and thousands of church fathers, going all the way up through the Reformation, up through Jonathan Edwards and so forth, even to the present, tens of thousands, the vast majority, have held to a young earth. They held to a global flood. They hold to these, as you would say, the simple reading of the text. You then have, on the other hand, what I would call the Greek view. Now, that sounds strange, but it's an Enlightenment view that is atheistic. There is no God, and it is an eternal universe, or it's in a universe that lasts for, a very long time, as Aristotle and other of the Greeks thought, which, as Doug Kelly points out, goes away under Justinian, and you see that really kind of goes underground, reemerges in the Renaissance. And you have then this view then that of this, what I would call atheistic, an atheistic old enduring earth, and then a heavily theistic young earth that comes from the revelation of Scripture. Then you have in between here these two groups that really appear in the, really very specifically you can find them, this what are called old earth progressive creationists. And you saw this appear really in the early 19th century, men like Adam Sedgwick in the Church of England, who said, I think the earth is very old, but I think God, I don't think Genesis is really accurate history. So we need to take this old earth history and figure out a way to construct some way of God doing these creation events. And so it's a multiple creation events over long periods in between it. So guys like Sedgwick, Cuvier, even Agassiz out of Harvard would have held this view. They would have not necessarily held that Genesis was history. Many of them would probably not even held that Jesus was God, and that's a key point here. But they did not hold to an evolutionary view. The evolutionary view, this theistic evolutionary view, is really something that came about with the time of Darwin. Pre-Darwin, in a way, a guy like Chambers, writing this very famous and influential book, The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, where he is introducing this idea of this evolution of the world. And it's a view that, again, we said comes from the Enlightenment, and he is taking Christianity and trying to make it work. A gentleman by the name of Asa Gray, friend of Darwin's, when Darwin presented his view, he said, well, I get this idea of long ages in development. Can we put God in this? And so let's make it theistic evolution. So these really is our playing field that you see today. You have our young earth creationists. You have, and the divide here is time. And then you have your progressive creationists who would see God making progressive creation events. I think now the view is a new event every 20 million years. And then there's an extinction events. And these are major extinction and minor. They basically are taking the timeline that is provided by these old earth. You have the theistic evolutionists, which would say, no, there aren't progressive creation. There aren't these individual creation events. Everything comes from a common ancestor. And then you have your classic evolutionists who generally would say, yes, this is some long progression and there is no God. I think the reason why we made this as our bifurcation, even though many of the men in these camps might say, or the holders of these views, might believe in the deity of Christ, and they might hold to some of the similar soteriology issues and so forth. My understanding is that they are borrowing a history that they did not create. And so this old, enduring earth is the basis of naturalism. Naturalism, the idea that nature is all that exists and all that ever happens, that has to have a historical framework to work in. And so I would argue that in many cases, men like Jean-Pierre Laplace, the famous French astronomer for the nebular hypothesis, who rejected God entirely as an atheist, and he had this idea of a long and enduring universe. A gentleman like Comte de Buffon, who was a naturalist, but also looked at the geological record and was an atheist and said, surely these are long ages and the earth has been here a long time. He would take a ball of iron and heat it up and then say, how long did it take to cool? Well, that must be how old the earth is. He would extrapolate supposedly the age of the earth. And then Cuvier, French naturalist, a paleontologist, a brilliant man, but he looked and he said, I'm going to burst the limits of time. And I am going to basically look at these fossils, and clearly these are different periods of time. And so these three men were highly influential at building a naturalistic history, and they rejected Genesis as history. And so I think that this idea that these men were in any way Christian, as we would understand them, is not true. This was being built inside the Enlightenment to have a philosophy rest upon it. And I think that's been mistaken by a lot of people. So there's no false dichotomy. The dichotomy is between two views of history. And so when you see that, you realize that, oh, the progressive creationists, they're just borrowing this history and they're kind of whitewashing it. They're making moving the furniture around, but they get all of their numbers and they get all of their structure from this long naturalistic view of history. It didn't start with them. They're rejecting Genesis, and then a guy like, just to finish, a guy like Hutton, James Hutton, the idea of the starter of uniformitarianism, is a Scotsman in the late 18th century, followed by Charles Lyell, we talk about in the film, who was a lawyer. They were deists. They didn't believe in Jesus as divine. They didn't believe the Bible was the Word of God. And Lyell said, I want to get Moses out of the rocks. So there was a great intentionality to create a structure of history in which the revelation of God could not be found. And I think that we today forget the power of history, of events that happened. And so I feel like that's why biblical theology is so important, because we see that there is a God who has revealed himself in time and space. And that if you take those revelations of real flesh, real blood at different times of people, whether it's walking in the garden with Adam, whether it is revealing himself to Moses, whether it's revealing himself to Abraham, these are real events that if we'd been there, we'd have seen him too, or heard him. That I think that the denial of that's what this is about. And so if we can deny those starting at Genesis, that just rolls its way through. So I appreciate the frustration that some people may feel this is a false dichotomy, but it's not, because you can look at any of these views of their views of history and realize that, no, that comes exactly from someone else's view. And they're borrowing it, hoping to kind of create this halfway house between the two. So sorry to go on like that long, but it's complex, and most people don't know the history of how these ideas came about.
Well, let's see if we can summarize this.
Yes, please.
So let's suppose that we divide this up into four pieces. So we have atheistic evolutionary positions. Then we have theistic evolutionary positions. And then we have what we would just call old earth creationists. Or
progressive creationists, how they like to call themselves.
Okay. And then we will have, I like to call them near-time creationists, but young earth creationists, those who look at the historical narrative of Genesis as being what it appears to be. So the charge of false dichotomy is coming from the progressive creationists.
Yeah, most so, and probably even a theistic evolutionist.
Okay. So let's say that the charge of a false dichotomy is coming from the theistic evolutionists. What they're doing is they're drawing a line saying, no, we're theistic.
Correct.
So you've drawn a false dichotomy because they're thinking that what we were doing was discussing the issue between atheistic and theistic people, right? So they would say, well, that's a false dichotomy. Then if you're talking about the progressive creationists, who said it's a false dichotomy, they're saying, no, the line is between those who believe that God was creative in his work.
That's right, yeah.
as
Immediately
opposed
creative.
to the theistic evolution who think evolution is doing the work. As opposed to what we're saying is that, no, that's not the line that we were drawing. We were drawing the line from a historical perspective. Correct?
That's correct.
And so that's why we would say, no, it's not a false dichotomy, although each of these has drawn the line based upon something that we were not talking about. Would that be correct?
That's right. I think that I was even talking to a guy who's involved with the film, and we were discussing this. And I, as a filmmaker, you always have a certain level of frustration because, I mean, you can see I like to be I like to be able to do the details. I don't want to represent someone wrong. But a film, in many ways, is a very controlled medium, and you can only say so much. And I had thought about this, and I brought this up with him, actually. We were talking about this, about, well, I know progressive creationists are going to be frustrated at this, and I know that, theistic evolutionists, of course, will be frustrated. He said, well, you really don't need to worry about this. He goes, of course there are other views, but it's like the Super Bowl. There are only two teams that are really pushing against each other. But I think that's where I would agree that this idea of time, it is the most consequential. It's the only thing that we care about. We've got watches everywhere. Look on our phone. We know that time is what matters.
Sure.
And what happens in time is matters. I had someone the other day tell me, well, I'm really more interested in learning the events of history and not when they happened. Like Stonewall Jackson, I think he's very important. And I said, but it wouldn't be useful to know that he fought in World War I, would it?
Right.
He said, well, I guess you're right. It's helpful to know that he died at a certain time, and that's one of the reasons Gettysburg went the way it went. Pretty consequential. Small events and big events, hugely consequential. So that's our dichotomy.
Right.
I think it's a fair one.